Hi everybody, welcome to Unit 5, Video 6. If you don't have your Unit 5 note packet out, please go get it out now. All right, so let's take a look at this, number 6. I can use the number I to simplify square roots of negative numbers. Okay, so I is the imaginary number, and I stands for the square root of negative 1. And so here at the top are the rules that you kind of want to memorize. Because I is the square root of negative 1. If we were to square I, we would have negative 1, because you'd have radical negative 1 times radical negative 1, which would just give us negative 1. Here, I cubed, you want to think of it as I squared times I to the first, which would give you negative 1, because that's what we just said I squared is, times I, or I to the first. So when you multiply those together, you would get negative I. And I to the fourth, again, if you want to think about it as I squared times I squared, well, we already know I squared is negative 1. So it's negative 1 times negative 1 is 1. So it kind of goes in this pattern. I is the square root of negative 1. I squared is negative 1. I cubed is negative I. And I to the fourth is 1. Okay, so you're going to want to memorize all 4 of those because it'll just be easier. You can always break it down if you wanted to, but it's easier if you have them memorized. All right, so let's go ahead and try and talk about how to simplify now using the imaginary number. So now we're talking about non-real numbers, imaginary numbers. And so when we simplify this, you want to think about it as the square root of negative 1 times 3. And now that we are saying the square root of negative 1 is I, you can take the I out of radical, but you can't take the radical 3 because you can't do anything with the square root of 3. So your answer here is I rad 3. On this next one, again, you want to think about how can I simplify it. So you want to think about it as the square root of negative 1 times 16. Now 16 is a perfect square, so when we square root this, we're going to get 4i. So in this case, they both come out of radical. All right, this next one, negative 32. Again, you want to think about it as negative 1 times 16 times 2, because again, we're still trying to find the biggest perfect square factor. So then when I take it out of radical, the square root of 16 is going to give me 4. The square root of negative 1 is going to be turned into I, and I can't do anything with rad 2. So my final answer is 4i rad 2. Okay, I want you guys to pause the video and try number 4. Hopefully we all got 9i. All right, so this one, remember in between the 3 and the radical, there's an implied multiplication sign. So when we simplify here, you're thinking of as 3 square root negative 1 times 4. So when we take it out of radical, we're going to have 3 times 2i. And so then when I simplify that, I'm going to get 6i. Again, for number 6, there's that negative 1, you can think of it as a 1, so it's saying negative 1 times radical negative 27. So when you simplify this, again, you want to think about it as negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 times 9 times 3. So when we can take the square root of 9 and we can take the square root of negative 1. So this is going to turn into negative 1 times 3i rad 3, because we have this negative 1 in the beginning here. So then when I simplify, I get negative 3i rad 3. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to number 7. So when you have something like this, remember you can think of it as, you can write it out twice. So you can say 5i times 5i, or you can apply the square to both of them. So you're thinking of it as 5 squared times I squared. But remember when you do 5 squared, you're going to get 25. But then I squared, that's saying square root of negative 1 times square root of negative 1, which is just negative 1. So this is 25 times negative 1, which is negative 25. So by taking the imaginary number out of the radical and then applying our squares, it allows us to get an actual real number, okay? So here, again, you can put a 1 because we have 1 and negative and then the parentheses. Remember, there's that imaginary or the invisible 1 there. So we're going to say negative 1. Then I need to apply the square to what's in parentheses. And again, you could write it out twice if you wanted, or you can apply the square. So this is going to say times I squared. And remember, rad 2 squared is just going to be what was underneath the radical, which is just 2. So So don't put 4. It only gets rid of the radical. So then when I simplify this, I'm going to bring down this negative 1. I squared, remember we said, was negative 1. And then I have this times 2. So when I multiply all this together, negative 1 times negative 1 is a positive 1 times 2, leaves me with 2. All right, so again, when you do number 9, you have to apply the square to everything inside of the parentheses. So you're applying it to the radical, to the I, and to the negative here. So when you do that, a negative, because remember there's really like a 1 here, 1 times. So then you're saying negative 1 squared is going to give you a positive 1. Then you're going to get an I squared, so you can say positive 1. I squared times 7. So then you have 1 times negative 1 times 7, which is negative 7. Okay, I want you to go ahead and pause the video and try number 10. Okay, so let's see how you did here. So hopefully you noticed that when you applied this cube here, you got 2 cubed, which was 8, and then we got I cubed. And remember, I cubed you could break apart into I squared times I, or I to the first, because the exponent adds. 2 plus 1 will give you 3. So I cubed is negative I. So when I multiply those together, I get negative 8I. So then this is my answer right here. All right, so before you do anything, you always want to take out the imaginary component first. So with this square root of negative 7, first I'm going to start by thinking about it as negative 1 times 7 over 2I. And then I'm going to simplify what I can. So this is going to turn into I rad 7 when I take the square root of negative 1. And on the bottom, I have this 2I. And now I can simplify. So the 2I, or the I on top and the I on the bottom will cancel. So I'm left with rad 7 over 2. And again, you always want to simplify the imaginary component first. So let's go ahead and do that with number 12 here. So first we want to break it apart. So we have 5 rad negative 1 times 6. So then when I simplify this, I get 5I rad 6. When I do, so I'm going to bring down the minus sign here. And then again, I'm going to break it apart. And I'm going to say this is negative 1 times 4 times 6. So then when I simplify this, the square root of 4, so I get minus 2, the square root of negative 1, I get I, and then I have rad 6. Now, rad 6 and rad 6 are like terms, so I can combine them. So 5I rad 6 minus 2I rad 6 gives me 3I rad 6. Okay, I want you to pause the video and do number 13. Okay, let's go ahead and see how you did. So hopefully we both got 5I rad 2. So you wanted to, again, break down your factors and then take what you could out of radical. And since these two are like terms, rad 2 and rad 2, you can combine them. Okay, so let's go to the next page here. All right, and let me make this a little bigger. Okay, so let's do our next 2 problems. So again, before you can do your multiplication or anything, you can't start by multiplying negative 4 and negative 9 because you always have to take out the imaginary component first. So what you want to do here is you want to simplify it. So this is going to become 2I, so 2I times 3I. Okay, so now that I have this, now I can multiply them together. So 2I times 3I is going to give me 6I squared. But remember, we need to make sure everything is always fully simplified. And we know already that I squared is negative 1, because remember, it's rad negative 1 times rad negative 1. So this really is turning into 6 times negative 1, which is negative 6. All right. So for number 15, again, we need to simplify what we can. So the square root of 4 is 2, and we have this I in front, so this becomes 2I. Here on this next one, it's also going to become a 2I. And then when I multiply them together, I get 4I squared. But again, I know I squared is negative 1, so this is saying 4 times negative 1. So I'm going to end up with negative 4. Okay, so the next 2 problems. Assume that each variable represents a positive number. Okay, so What we need to do here then is we need to simplify what we can. So we want to take what we can out of radical. So let's break this apart into -1 times 3 times x squared. Okay, so then I'm going to go ahead and break apart the middle term too. So this is going to be -1 times 9 times 3 times x squared. And then the last one, so negative and then rad -1 times 9 times 5 times x squared. All right, so when I go ahead and simplify out of radical, I can take the square root of -1 and I can take the square root of x squared. So I'm going to get xi. You usually do the imaginary component second, okay? So you want the variable first and then the imaginary component I to come second. So xi rad 3, because I can't take the rad 3. All right, so for this next one here, the square root of 9 is 3, and I can take the square root of -1. So I have 3, and I have the square root of -1, and then I also have the square root of x squared is x. So this is 3xi rad 3. And then here I have, bring down the negative. I can take the square root of 9, which is going to give me 3. I can take the square root of x squared, which is x. And I can take the square root of -1, which is I. And then I'm left with rad 5. Okay, so now I want to combine any like terms that I have. So I have a like term right here. So xi rad 3 plus 3xi rad 3. So since they both have rad 3 and an x and an I can combine them. So this is 4xi rad 3 minus 3xi rad 5. All right, so we can go ahead. Oops. And here's our answer. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and go to the next one. We need to simplify it first before we can do anything. And I'm going to apply the radical to the top. So, okay, not the radical, the negative. I'm going to apply the negative to the numerator. You could apply it to the denominator. I think it's easier if it's just in the numerator. So you want to think of the numerator here as the square root of -1 times r. And this you can think of the square root of 5 times the square root, I'm going to say, of -20 over the square root of r. And so now we can simplify what we can. So this is going to become I rad r over rad 5 times here. I'm going to do the work up here. The square root of 20, of -20, I should say, sorry. -20, you can think about as -1 times 4 times 5. So when you take that out of radical, you're going to get the square root of 4 is 2. The square root of -1 is going to be I rad 5 over the square root of r. And now since this is multiplication here, remember the rules of multiplication say I'm allowed to cross simplify. So I can go ahead and simplify rad r and rad r. And I can simplify this rad 5 in the denominator with this one in the numerator. So then I'm left with just I times 2i. So I can go ahead and multiply those straight across. So I times 2i gives me 2i squared. But again, remember we know I squared is -1. So this is saying 2 times -1, which is going to, that's a -1, which is going to simplify. Let me make this a little better. 2 times -1, which is going to give us -2. All right, thanks for watching the video.